I had two PowerPoints with a very similar name. And of course, I managed to open the wrong one. Right. What I want to ask is it happening in France, this quiet revival? So when I go around to churches, and I'm sometimes invited to go to churches to talk about France mission, which is wonderful. If any of you belong to churches that might want to invite me or any of our area reps to do it, please don't hesitate to ask. We love doing that. I often share about how many um, evangelicals there are in France and this growth curve. And I point out that when France Mission started, there were far, far fewer evangelical churches and evangelicals in France than there are today. And I'm sure that the prayerfulness of God's people has been one of the factors in seeing this growth over recent decades. I often show these maps as well. I think they're quite powerful, these maps. This was back in 1970. The colours show how many evangelical churches there were in each of France's départements. That was the situation back then, a very cold map. And this was the situation just a couple of years ago. So it's quite dramatic when you see the change from that to that. Actually, there's still quite a lot of coolness in the map, obviously. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but there's much to give thanks for. And this is still continuing today. This is a headline from the English edition of Le Monde, just at the end of August. Evangelicalism in France continues to grow, driven by conversions. And I often finish my talk by saying something like, imagine if we saw growth like that in the UK church. Wouldn't that be amazing? Because for many years, the statistics have been telling us that at best, UK church growth is stagnant. But now I think maybe I have to change the ending to my talk a little bit, because it does feel as though we are beginning to see a bit of a change in England and Wales. Certainly, the quiet revival research doesn't concern Scotland or Northern Ireland. So I just want to have a think for this morning's presentation. Oh, it's the afternoon now, isn't it? About how things might be similar or different between England and Wales on the one hand and France on the other. And these are the areas that crop up in the Quiet Revival report: age, denominations, gender, politics, the Bible, ethnicity, well-being, and sharing faith. And I want to say something briefly about all of those, but I'll sort of dwell a bit more perhaps on some than others, because in some cases there's more data than there is in other areas. And it's worth saying that there isn't a single study like the Quiet Revival study in France that enables us to make direct comparisons. So I've had to dig around, and you'll see that sometimes I've used surveys that have been carried out. Sometimes I've looked to something more anecdotal, like newspaper reports. So it's not an exact science comparing these two countries in this sense, but hopefully it'll provide some interesting insights. So age is the first thing to have a think about. Who's in church? Who's in your church? Well, apparently, if we look globally, all of the age groups are now better represented in church, with the exception of my age group, the middle-aged, where there's been a decline. But the big increase between 2018 and 2025 is in the under 35s, going from 4% up to 16%, which is a massive increase. When we look at the situation in France, this was a survey done in 2022. It didn't refer to any particular denominations, just people who call themselves Christian. You can see there that overwhelmingly it was the older generation who were calling themselves Christian. But I suspect an awful lot of those would be cultural Christians, nominal Christians, if you like. It just means I'm not an atheist, I'm not a Muslim, therefore I'm a Christian. When we look at a survey which was done slightly more recently, specifically amongst Protestants, it was interesting to see that those who attend church are more likely to be younger in French Protestant churches. You can see there that there are a much higher proportion of under 35s, that's the blue column, attending church. Sorry, the blue column is the monthly figures, the orange column is the weekly figures, but the ones on the left are the under 35s. Far more under 35s attending church than over 35s within French Protestantism generally. And I would be very confident that that would be largely due to the impact of French evangelicalism as a very major part of the French Protestant scene. When we look at the situation in the Catholic Church, one very interesting phenomenon is the number of adult baptisms which are taking place. They're getting record numbers of adult baptisms, as was reported in Le Monde at the end of last year, a 31% increase over 2023, and they expected that would continue in 2025. And the vast majority of those who are being baptized as adults in the Catholic Church in France are younger people, again, under 35s. And this is something that was picked up in the British media. This is Premier Christianity. They ran two stories by Tony Wilson. The first in February, he went and visited a Catholic diocese in Toulouse in France, and found out that there were many students who were wanting to turn to Catholicism. We can't keep up with the number of students requesting baptism, is what the priests in this parish were saying. And then a bit later in May, he reported on the adult baptisms, which apparently all take place in the Catholic Church at the same time at Easter. 17,000 people just baptized in France. He says God is on the move. And he asks that question, is that quiet revival happening outside of the UK? I hadn't actually realized he'd asked that until I started researching the topic and found that he was asking a similar question. And it's made it, of course, into the mainstream media as well. This is The Economist, not particularly noted, I don't think, for its interest in religious matters, but they talk about France's improbable adult baptism boom. A secular country returns to the church. That's a little bit dramatic, but it's interesting that that's how they chose to report on it. Why is this happening, particularly amongst younger people? Well, some people have pointed to the influence of Catholic influencers, social media influencers. Of course, they have them in the Protestant world as well, but those who come from a Catholic background tend to have more followers, and there are some very well followed social media influences that could be playing a part. Maybe too, the fact that there is a massive worldwide Catholic youth movement. You may have seen the reports over the summer about the Jubilee of Youth in Rome. And there is something attractive, I'm sure, particularly amongst younger people, when there's many who are gathering in one place to do something, particularly if it's an international thing that has a sort of a snowball effect. So that could also be a factor. But yes, age is interesting, and it does look as though even if the majority of those who are in the Catholic Church or who are nominally Catholic would be older people, there does seem to be a move amongst younger people returning to Catholicism, and there's certainly the case that within evangelical Protestantism, you tend to have a younger demographic. So there's some similarity there, I think, between the two countries. When it comes to denominations, this is the findings, or these are the findings that they had in the Quiet Revival. So for our Anglicans amongst us, sorry, the picture is not so great for Anglicans. Again, I think that's understandable because it is the state church, and where there is nominalism, it will be more likely, I suspect, to be within C of E churches, and we see a decline. Obviously, there are many Anglican churches which are thriving, but they tend to be certain types of Anglican churches in certain places. When we look at the Catholics, it's the reverse picture. The Catholic Church is growing its number of or its proportion of church attendees in the UK, as are Pentecostals. They're also growing quite strongly. And it's interesting, the green bar that you have there, that's specifically, again, the younger groups. And you can see once again that younger groups seem to be more prevalent in Catholicism and Pentecostalism, but less prevalent in Anglicanism. Difficult to find specific French statistics for this, but this is a survey from 2023, I think it was, which was talking about religion in general. And here you see that Catholicism has been down over the last 15 years. The arrow's pointing down. Islam the arrow's pointing up, but so are other Christians. The arrow is pointing up. And that would be, I think, predominantly due to evangelical Christianity and the growth of evangelical Christianity that we see there. And within the world of Protestantism generally, as this article from La Croix, which is the main Catholic newspaper, says, the market share, if you like, of evangelicals who tend to be younger and tend to be more active churchgoers is constantly on the increase, said La Croix. So yes, Protestantism as a whole is doing okay, doing quite well in some respects, but it's largely due to the increase within evangelical Protestants rather than the traditional Protestant churches in France. I think I'll skip over that. This is just showing the situation in the Catholic Church in particular. From the year 2000 to where we are today, you can see this is the number of religious marriages that are celebrated in church. You can see that fewer and fewer people are getting married in churches, in Catholic churches. Obviously, there was a huge dip around 2020 because of COVID. Things have recovered since COVID, but they still haven't recovered to the pre-COVID levels. And the statistics for the number of marriages is mirrored in a very similar way for the total number of baptisms. The baptisms I spoke about earlier are adult baptisms, which is obviously not the norm within the Catholic Church. The norm is for infant baptism. And you can see here that when you combine adult and infant baptisms, you have a very similar decline in the numbers, a bit of a pickup after COVID, but still not back to where it was. So those are indicators that Catholicism is not the force that it once was. Another very clear indication, Patrice talked about the fact that there aren't enough vocations within the Protestant evangelical world. That is equally true in the Catholic world. There are far fewer people going forward for ordination today than there were 50, 60 years ago. And of course, that also has an impact on church buildings and the need to close churches. Again, that's something that Patrice talked about. That is happening quite a lot, I suppose, in many towns and villages in France where the building is not frequented. Therefore, there's no funds because there aren't people giving to support the work, and the local town council doesn't have the funds either to be able to look after the building. And so many of these churches, which are of historic interest, but people can't afford to maintain them, are having to close. And that's, again, a sign of the decline, I suppose, of the presence of Catholicism within France. So denominations, yes, I suppose summing up, we'd say that there is something similar happening in both countries, in the sense that the official, not the official religion in France, but the dominant religion, Catholicism in France, Anglicanism within the UK, is in decline. And as I say, I think that's probably down to nominalism, because there's very little value today to anybody saying, oh yes, I'm C of E. Why would you say that these days? Because there's no advantage to it. So you're more like to say, well, I'm agnostic, or I'm not sure what I am, or I'm an atheist or whatever. So yeah, the landscape seems to be changing in similar ways in both countries. Gender. This was a report from the Daily Telegraph talking about the extraordinary resurgence of the Catholic faith in Britain. Interesting that they chose as their cover photo a young woman, because actually when you get into the article, the cleric talks about the large number of men, young men, who are coming into the Catholic Church, and he acknowledges that part of that could be down to the role of influences with the very conservative values who are attracting young men who feel attracted to some of those values. But he says, I think it's more complicated than that, and I think he's right. But it's fascinating when you look at the Quiet Revival data, just how present men seem to be in churches, because for many years this absolutely wasn't the case. And you can see again the dark red bars are men, the sort of salmon colored bars are women, and for every age group, men are more numerous, apart from the over 65 group, where men and women are equal in terms of church attendance. So I found that a very interesting statistic. I found it virtually impossible to find any statistics for France about gender, but there was this one survey that was published in the periodical Regard Protestant, which had been conducted in MLK Church, which is a mega church, an evangelical Pentecostal mega church near Paris. 4,500 respondents. So it's quite a lot of people whose data they're looking at, but I couldn't access the full range of data. I had to pay to get to it, and I'm sorry, I was too mean to pay for it. But it did say in the headline, as you can see here, that it is a majority of women in the congregation and majority of people from an international, intercultural background. So it may well be that, and perhaps our French friends who are here can comment on whether they tend to see more women than men in evangelical churches. I'm not sure about that. Politics is something that's raised in the report as well, and not just in the report, but it's been picked up by the secular media, who've been talking about this growth in Christianity. So Melanie Phillips in the Times, talking specifically about Catholicism, links it to the potential rise in Christian nationalism, which is very much an American phenomenon that is beginning, it would appear, to have an influence in the UK. And when we had the recent Unite the Kingdom marches in the UK, there was definitely some presence of co-opting of Christian symbols, but the Guardian in its coverage reckoned that this deployment had little to do with religious faith. It was more about harking back to traditional values that were associated with Christianity rather than the church itself. But that seems to be something that is a thing in the UK. But it's more complicated than that, because the Financial Times, well, they ran a story back in April of this year about the young liberal Christians who were embracing Christianity for the first time and getting involved in Christianity because of their social conscience and social awareness and certain movements. So I'm not sure that you can draw any hard and fast rules about politics on the UK side. And I suspect it's similar in France. I don't know. I think perhaps the church voters in France tend to be, if they're Christians, slightly more conservative than in the UK. Again, our French-based friends can comment on that. But I couldn't really find very much. This headline, French Catholics, young French Catholics tend to be more conservative than their elders. I think that's predominantly about forms of worship, traditional mass, etc. But I think it might also spill over into slightly more conservative politics. So not a great deal I can say about politics other than to note it as a factor. The Bible, this is a more relevant topic, I think, and again a very interesting piece of research in the Quiet Revival. Really encouraging, I think. Just look at how many young people are reading their Bible weekly. That's the sort of the lime coloured bar. They are the biggest group. The 18s to 34s are reading their Bible, 80% of them at least weekly. The older group, the 55 pluses, many of us find ourselves in that group. I certainly do. We are not so good at reading weekly. We're better, if I can put it that way, at reading monthly, but that's rather sad, isn't it? It suggests that older people across the churches in Britain are only having occasional recourse to scripture, whereas younger people are wanting much more scriptural input, which is, that's the encouragement for us, I suppose. When I looked at France, again, very difficult to get statistics, but I did see this report which suggests that French Protestants are reading the Bible much less than they used to. So that's really sad. 20% only read the Bible weekly compared to 34% 15 years ago. That's a significant decline. But it says evangelical Protestants stand out. They're different. Again, I don't know whether Tom and Dave have the impression that their congregations or the congregations that they might visit, that there's been a decline in Bible reading, but that seems to be the case in Protestantism generally, according to this report. Ethnicity. Well, the Quiet Revival reported that it was those that are traditionally thought of as being ethnic minorities that are actually more present in churches if they're young. 18 to 34-year-olds, you've got nearly 50% of young black people who are regularly in church. Over a third of mixed race young people. And for white people, well, it's less than 20%. That's more than it was back in 2018. But it's interesting, isn't it, that it seems to be the ethnic groups other than the white ethnic group, which are really the driving force behind the Quiet Revival. Again, I couldn't find specific data in France, but again, this broader survey from 2023 suggested that if you have migration in your family background or overseas descendants in your family background, you are twice as likely to be affiliated to a religion than if you don't, which I think is a similar kind of finding to the one that we see in the Quiet Revival. And certainly when I go to visit French churches, they seem to be more ethnically diverse than I would anticipate seeing in many UK churches outside of the big urban population centres, which is great. And we know that heaven is going to be multicultural, multi-ethnic. So it's really encouraging to see churches that are already living that reality. Well-being. This was something that the Quiet Revival focused on quite a lot. Basically, church is good for you. Of course, it's the place where we come to encounter the one God. It's a place of spiritual encounter, but it's also something that has knock-on effects for our general life. People feel that life is more meaningful and more hopeful, and they feel like they're better connected to their local communities if they go to church. And the differences are stark in the figures there. You can see the top figures relate to churchgoers, and then the smaller figures at the bottom relate to those who aren't churchgoers. As Dave said, it's great to invite people to come to church because there's something special that happens in church that can really really benefit people spiritually, of course, but also just in terms of their general well-being. Again, very difficult to find equivalent French data, but this story was a heartwarming story. Actually, it was from young people of various backgrounds talking about how there's more to life than just consumerism, and they are after connection, they are after meaning, they are after something deeper than the latest smartphone or the latest Netflix series or whatever it might be. Sharing faith, I found this really encouraging in the Quiet Revival. 31% of non-churchgoers say they would attend church if they were invited by a friend or a family member. That's nearly a third, over a third, for 18 to 24-year-olds. There's a significant proportion of people who are interested in finding out more about the Bible who don't currently read it. And nearly half of 18 to 24-year-olds who don't go to church think it's a positive thing that their friends are talking to them about church. So that's a kind of an open door, isn't it, for us to share our faith, because people are interested, people are intrigued. Not everybody, but significant numbers are interested and are even willing to try church out, as Dave was suggesting earlier. And this is something that, again, I've not been able to find specific data, equivalent data in France, but Dave was very much involved in editing this book, well, writing this book, I think, actually, which came out 2 or 3 years ago, Evangelizing Secularized France in the 21st Century. And they, through surveys, they assessed in this book what were the most important factors in those who have no background in the evangelical church coming to faith within a French evangelical context. And these were the most important factors that they found: a personal relationship with somebody. Those are the people who it's easiest to invite. A good welcome when they come to the church, being heard, being listened to when they come to church, not just being talked at, but listened to. The possibility of being able to ask questions, things they don't understand, accessible, relevant teaching. This goes back to what Dave was talking about when they have that moment when they try and open, and Tom talked about as well, they talk about things that are happening in people's lives and in the wider culture, and being able to do things together in small groups. These are all ways in which people find it easier to come to faith. And it's similar, I think, to some of the findings that the Quiet Revival report talks about. So those are some of the areas, well, all of the areas actually, that the Quiet Revival talked about. And I've done my best to try and sketch in some of the ways in which we can see in some areas similar things happening in France, and in other areas it's much more difficult to say because there just isn't similar data. But finally, I did ask AI, I asked ChatGPT to answer the question, is something similar to the Quiet Revival in England and Wales happening in France? And it gave me a very full answer, actually. But this is the final conclusion that it came up with, which I thought was quite interesting. It said this: so while France is seeing some encouraging signs, notably a surge in adult Catholic conversions around Easter 2025, I would add in, and it hasn't picked this up, ChatGPT, and the growth in evangelical congregations that has been going on for many years, despite some encouraging signs, this does not replicate the broader Quiet Revival in England and Wales, which is defined by sustained increases in regular monthly church attendance among young adults and across denominations. We're seeing signs, but we're not seeing everything that we apparently are seeing in the UK. Now, I don't know whether that's been your experience in your own church. In our church, we are definitely seeing signs of this. So just last Sunday, for example, a young guy came along, brought by a family member. I got chatting to him afterwards. First time he'd ever been in a church building. I invited him to come to an Alpha course. He came with me on Tuesday evening to the Alpha course, really enjoyed the Alpha course. and said at the end of the evening, I'll see you on Sunday. And he took a Bible away with him. So, there's a young guy sort of, living out, I suppose, that quiet revival that is being talked about. But let me stop, because I think it's my time is up. So thank you very much for bearing with me as I crack through quite a lot of information there. I'm happy to share the slides, and happy, obviously, for the talk the talk is being recorded, and I'll make that available if you want to catch up with anything in more detail. Thank you.